Hello, witches. It's Keldon. I hope you're all doing well. It's been a while since I've used this platform, so I hope it's all working. Well, welcome to my virtual release party. It's definitely an exciting day. So today is the official release of my book, The Witch's Sabbath, an exploration of history, folklore, and modern practice. So this is my already pretty beat up copy. But thank you all for being here. It's nice to be able to gather with people, especially people from all over, to share this project that I'm so excited to finally be able to share with you all. You're finally able to read this thing that I have been working on for quite some time. So welcome. So we're going to do a few things today. We're going to start, I'm going to do some reading from the book, and we're going to do that for about 30 minutes. And then at 2 o'clock my time, which is Central Time, we will hopefully be joined by the fabulous Jason Mankey, who wrote the foreword for the book. And he and I are just going to have a lively chat about the book, and I'm sure about history, because we are both big history nerds. And then we'll do that for probably a half hour. And then the kind of last part of this will be Q&A. So if you have questions, I would save them until we're getting to the end of the chat with Jason. And then we'll kind of go from there, and we'll see how long that takes. I can sit and blab forever. So yeah, we'll see. And the chat, sorry. Okay, there we go. The chat on here is a little bit delayed, so I'm gonna try to keep watch of it on my phone on YouTube. That way I can kind of be up to date on things. But anyways, that's just all the boring housekeeping things, I guess. I hope you're all having a great day. Thank you to everyone who has pre-ordered a book, ordered a signed copy of the book. That's super awesome. For people who have yet to order a book, get on that. But also, thank you anyways for being here. I encourage people, as you read it, when you finish, make sure if you're willing to leave a review on Amazon, even if you didn't order it from Amazon, that's incredibly helpful for authors, because that is, for better or worse, the place where people are really getting these books from, and it does help. So make sure to do that if you are willing. And additionally, if you want to or are going to post pictures of your book on Instagram, make sure to tag me, use the tag The Witch's Sabbath. That way I can find it, because it's always fun to see pictures of my book out in the wild or in people's spaces or whatnot. So, okay, so I'm going to read some different parts of the book. It was hard to just pick a few. So let's get started, and we're going to kind of jump around in the book a little bit, but I figured I'd start by reading sort of a kind of a narrative that the book starts with in the introduction that really kind of gives you a glimpse at what the Witch's Sabbath is. Okay, so here we go. On the night of Walpurga, a lone witch approaches their fireplace with a quiet knowing. The embers have cooled and turned to ash, leaving the hearth both still and silent, with the exception of a ticking clock sitting upon the mantel. The hour approaches midnight. Removing the cork from a small clay pot, the witch dips the fingers of their left hand into an ointment that gives off a pungent, earthy aroma. With concentrated movements, the witch rubs the sticky salve onto their wrists, behind their ears, and upon the soles of their feet. Then, mounting a broomstick that had previously been resting against the gray stone fireplace, the witch closes their eyes and utters the words, "Thout, tout-a-tout, tout, throughout and about." And with a whoosh, they are carried up the chimney and out into the night. The wind howls as the witch soars across the darkened sky, an inky black tapestry devoid of the stars and moon, which have been obscured by thick clouds. The witch flies over the tops of houses where inhabitants sleep restlessly, their heads filled with strange dreams. Farther and farther the witch journeys, over city walls and into the wild countryside where few dare to go. Higher and higher they travel, up the side of a looming mountain that has the reputation of being haunted by ghosts and fairies. Finally, reaching the summit, the witch touches down upon the ground in the middle of a clearing where others have already started to gather around a roaring bonfire. The boisterous scene that unfolds before the witch's eyes is both awe-inspiring and frightening. Around the fire, which has an unearthly greenish glow, other witches dance in a ring with their backs to the flames. The strange dance is set to the tune of an eerie song played on flutes and tambourines. Additionally, witches sit nearby, crafting dolls and mixing powders, preparing these items for the working of spells. Still other witches are gathered around a long banquet table, feasting upon bread and wine. Enthroned at the head of the gathering is a man dressed all in black, the devil. He watches over the witches as they revel in his honor, each act one of empowerment for both the witches and himself. Shedding all of their mundane worry and stress, and casting off their mortal inhibitions, the witch joins the festivities, which will continue until the rooster crows, announcing the arrival of dawn. So that is the very start of the introduction, and that is sort of a image that I compiled using different pieces of folklore from different narratives throughout time, whether those are from trial transcripts or later folklore stories. I wanted to give readers just sort of an image of what's to come and kind of what they themselves might participate in if they choose to travel into the other world to attend the Sabbath. I also really love writing stories, so that was particularly fun to write. Okay, so now we're going to just read a little bit from the start of chapter 1. And chapter 1, by the way, is entitled Stoking the Sabbath Fire. Throughout time and across cultures, there have always been witches in one form or another. Individuals with magical powers that were typically used in order to cause harm to those within the witches' community. Through their wicked words and detestable deeds, witches could bring about illness, blight local crops, or cause other assorted disasters. As such, they have always presented a sort of danger to society at large, a shroud of menace that threatened to poison the daily lives of godly folk. However, for a long time, witches were seen as solitary practitioners who went about their dark arts alone. But by the time the first wave of European witch trials started, terrifying ideas had begun to emerge regarding large groups of witches who would fly through the dead of night to diabolical meetings with the devil. These nocturnal gatherings, which would become a central element in many trials, involved a host of nefarious activities, such as demon worship, casting of spells for harm, feasting on the flesh of infants, and wild orgies. This coming together of witches and the devil has been referred to by many names throughout history and folklore, from generic terms such as assembly to more specific ones such as synagogue. However, the name that has stuck the longest, and that which people are most familiar with today, is Sabbath. From a modern vantage point, the Sabbath is a relatively tidy, well-defined construct, like an intricately woven tapestry full of rich detail. But like a tapestry, the image of the witch's Sabbath was woven out of many disparate threads. That was a process that occurred gradually over time. Much to the chagrin of researchers, myself included, there is no clear point of origin for the witch's Sabbath, no distinct moment in time when the concept was sparked into existence. Despite its unknown exact moment of creation, the notion of the witch's Sabbath emerged during the Middle Ages from a mixture of ecclesiastical ideas regarding demonology, fused with elements of early paganism that had been preserved in popular folklore. Rather than being a monolithic entity, in the beginning, the Sabbath was more of a loose framework upon which assorted regional and cultural elements would be added over time. The end result, and what we are left with today, is vividly detailed stories regarding witches gathering in the night to do their evil spells and pay homage to the devil. But in order to have a well-rounded understanding of these tales and the role they play in today's practice of witchcraft, we must determine how their basic structure was first composed. To do so, it will be necessary to dismantle the narrative as it's known today and to examine all the individual parts. Thus, to truly comprehend what would become known as the witch's Sabbath, we must start by pulling out the threads of history and folklore and unravel the tapestry altogether. So that narrative that we started with is really codified. It's really put together. But at the very beginning, the witch's Sabbath didn't look like that. That really happened over time, that all of these different pieces sort of came together and formed this image. And that's really what a big part of this book is about, is looking at all of those individual threads and seeing how they would come together over time, including how they've come to reemerge in our modern practice of witchcraft. That being said, I want to jump back to another part from the introduction. And this is a part that I've been talking a lot lately on YouTube and on Instagram, but I figured it'd be worth it to sort of read a very eloquent, well-written, if I do say so myself, message, and that's on the use of witch trial transcripts, because that is a big part of this book. In discussing the witch's Sabbath, I will be frequently citing the confessions of those individuals who were accused of witchcraft across Europe and in the early American colonies. In mentioning these cases, I am in no way attempting to suggest that the accused were actual practitioners of witchcraft. We know today that most confessions were obtained under torture, during which individuals would have confessed to just about anything in order to escape pain and death. Additionally, others were subjected to sleep deprivation and other hostile conditions, under which both their physical and mental health would have rapidly deteriorated. Interrogators were also guilty of using leading questions and other techniques in order to manipulate the narrative to fit their own agenda. Finally, confessions were not always recorded verbatim, and later translations were susceptible to being distorted, sometimes even intentionally so. That being said, while those accused were most likely innocent wholesale, the fact remains that many of the details presented in their confessions, whether given by the accused or inserted by interrogators, reflected pre-established beliefs regarding the practice of witchcraft. Author Emma Wilby notes that when it comes to confessions given by the accused, and this is her quote, "We must assume that when crafting their accounts of benign aquelarre festivities, suspects drew on the gossip and propaganda surrounding the nocturnal meetings of witches that circulated in the region both before and during the witch prosecution," end quote. Thus, confessional statements can be mined as repositories of folk beliefs, in this case, those that pertain specifically to the witch's Sabbath. An examination of trial transcripts allows us, as present-day practitioners, to better understand the ways in which the accounts given by the accused inadvertently influence the development of modern witchcraft. Additionally, such explorations also provide us with the wealth of lore that can help further inspire our practice as witches moving forward. So it's really important in general, but as you read this book, to understand that the point of this, when we talk about witch trial confessions, is not to suggest that these things actually happened or that these people were actual witches, but that their stories encapsulate pre-established folkloric beliefs. And what I think many people unfortunately miss or don't always understand is that our modern witchcraft has been so influenced by those stories. And we talk about that later in this book when we talk about some of the reemergence of the Sabbath in modern witchcraft, when we look specifically at the ideas of the witch cult hypothesis. So I encourage readers just to keep that in mind, that we can't ignore these trial transcripts, but we also can't take them at face value. So we've got to really use our critical thinking skills, but also to use our imaginations at the same time. It very much is a liminal state. So talking about the Sabbath in modern witchcraft, let's talk a little bit about the Sabbath in traditional witchcraft. Just as the concept of the witch's Sabbath was reinterpreted and woven into the fabric of the modern Wiccan religion, it has also become a central feature within traditional witchcraft. However, while the Sabbath has become a set of seasonal holidays for Wiccans, for traditional witches, it remains an otherworldly spirit gathering. Much of the inspiration underlying the second modern interpretation of the Sabbath comes from the works of Sparr, the Grants, and Chumbley. As such, traditional witches recognize the Sabbath as being a liminal, dreamlike experience, much in the same way that it was described by Sparr. Additionally, similar to Kenneth Grant's explanations of atavastic resurgence, traditional witches viewed the Sabbath as a place of primordial power, encoded within certain symbolism, such as the backward imagery found therein. Finally, in line with Chumbley's ideas, traditional witches experience the Sabbath as a place of mystical gnosis and transformation. It is a place where spirit communication occurs and profound acts of magic can be wrought. Of course, beyond the works of these occultists, traditional witches draw inspiration from the folklore regarding the Sabbath, particularly that which comes from trial records. Folkloric accounts of the witch's Sabbath are carefully examined by practitioners in hopes of discovering secret wisdoms hidden within their imagery, wisdom that can be extracted and used in modern practice. However, while the written lore can provide valuable insights, it is in the direct experience of the witch's Sabbath and the primal atavastic current therein that true knowledge and understanding of this legendary gathering can be attained. So there's some things in there that maybe don't make sense just at this moment, specifically talking about those three occultists. That's context that occurs earlier in that chapter. But hopefully this just gives you a taste of, you know, what you're going to find in this book and the way that the witch's Sabbath is approached, specifically in traditional witchcraft. So in the form of witchcraft that I'm working from, you know, this is not a set of seasonal holidays that is discussed within the book as kind of one of the two ways in which the Sabbath has reemerged in modern practice. But in traditional witchcraft, we're really looking at the Sabbath as an otherworldly gathering of spirits. And it's a place where we commune with spirit, we work magic, we learn lessons. There's really a lot of different possibilities of what could take place at the Sabbath. Okay, so we still have about 10 minutes, and there's one last section I kind of pulled out to talk about, just on the off chance that we'd have a little extra time. I wasn't sure how long it was going to take me to read some of this. So I kind of chose sort of a random section to talk about, because those other ones kind of go together, and I wanted to kind of pull something out. And one of the things that I was really interested in during my research was the role of the Queen of the Sabbath. So in most narratives regarding the Sabbath is presided over by the devil. However, there are some cases where there is a female spirit who is either co-leading the Sabbath or even sometimes the singular leader of the Sabbath. And also, I apologize, I like just getting over a cold. So let's talk about the Queen of the Sabbath, because she's pretty cool. In addition to the devil, the Sabbath was also at times presided over by a woman. The title given to this woman occasionally varies. For example, Isabel Gowdy alluded to the special position of Coven Maiden. Additionally, when discussing the Sabbath in 1697, a young man named James Lindsay from Paisley, Scotland, mentioned the presence of a woman named Antiochia. It was noted that this woman was the devil's wife. However, more often than not, the female leader was referred to as the Sabbath Queen. Throughout trial confessions from Europe and the early American colonies, there are occasional references to a witch who had obtained an elevated status within the coven and thus received special favors or attention from the devil. Typically, this was a witch who had demonstrated a proclivity for malefica greater than those of her coven mates. The position of queen could be a permanent one, and such was the case in Salem when the devil supposedly granted Martha Carrier the grand title of Queen of Hell. Though it seems that the position of Sabbath Queen was usually only a temporary one, being passed on from one witch to another over time. For instance, in 18th century Poland, a woman named Odorana was said to have served as a Sabbath Queen, but the title was later inherited by someone else after her execution in 1737. In her appearance, the Sabbath Queen was normally characterized by her distinctive beauty and regal attire. Jeanette Diabati noted in her 1609 confession that the devil always selected the prettiest woman to be the Sabbath Queen. In Spain, the queen was said to wear an elaborate gold chain around her neck, with each link along its length depicting the devil's face. Meanwhile, in Poland, she was described as wearing a gold crown and being surrounded by children. In another Polish account, the queen's crown was replaced by a pair of golden horns. Marion Grant of Aberdeen, Scotland, confessed in 1597 that she had attended dances at which the devil was present, with a woman dressed in a white waistcoat who was known as Our Lady. Margaret Talesor of Alloa, Scotland, mentioned in 1658 that there had been a mysterious woman at the Sabbath who was dressed in a green waistcoat with gray tails. The role of the Sabbath Queen is, in some instances, seems to have been a passive one, with the queen having little to do with coven leadership. For example, one of the primary honors given to those named as queen was a seat next to the devil during the Sabbath feast. In this sense, while the witch in question may have been chosen for her powers in the malefic arts, her position as Sabbath Queen was less about power and more about pageantry. However, this was not always the case, as the queen was at times shown to play more important parts at the Sabbath, including taking on elevated roles during rituals. The accused Spanish witches reported that during the Black Mass, the Queen of the Aquelarre would sit by the devil's side where she collected offerings. In one of her hands, she held an alms box, and in the other, she held a pax painted with an image of the devil's face. Delancre notes that the Grand Mistress, or Sabbath Queen, aided in the initiation of children as witches. Specifically, she instructed the children on what to do during the ritual and helped them to recite the proper words of renunciation. In Scotland, Isabel Gowdy further hinted at the Queen's prominence during rituals and magical workings when she expressed that we do no great matter without our maiden. So, the Sabbath Queen, pretty cool. And you'll find a lot more information about that in the book. I see that Jason has joined. So I think I'm going to go ahead and add him to the stream. Hello, Jason. You're muted. You gotta unmute yourself.
Let's try that again. Hi, Keldon.
Hi.
Wow, it's so nice to see you. I haven't seen you in like years.
I know.
Really, you know?
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for putting together an amazing book.
Woo! Also, just real quick, you recently had a birthday.
I did.
So happy belated birthday.
January 4th, the same birthday as Doreen Valiente.
Yep.
That's so cool to me.
That is honestly really cool. I, meanwhile, have the same birthday as Kim Kardashian. So,
yuck.
I mean, I don't know.
I'm so sorry.
So, yeah, I wrote this book. Let's talk about it. You wrote the foreword. You wrote a really great foreword. You shared a very interesting personal story, which I really loved.
Yeah, that was my first witch ritual, was like not with people from this world, but with people and entities from another world. And I remember it really specifically. You know, I was driving back home. My dad was driving us back home from a concert that we had gone to see with some of his friends. And it was the summer solstice. And I think those people were in the car with us too. So there were like 5 people. And I just kind of nodded out, you know, along the car door. And all of a sudden I was somewhere else. And it was the coolest thing because it was my first ritual ever with others. And I didn't think about it for a long time. I thought, you know, maybe this is just something I made up in my brain, right? I think, which is what we all do. But, you know, when you have an experience like that that sticks with you, there's more to it than something you've just made up.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of a big part, especially when it comes to the practice of hedge crossing or spirit flight, is I think a lot of times people kind of psych themselves out about like, am I making this up? Is this real? Am I really doing it right? And hopefully I will put some of that to rest for people who read this. You know, I find that these otherworldly experiences, especially crossing into the other world, it's often a lot less, I guess sort of, I think oftentimes what people are expecting is that like their body is going to completely leave, or their spirit's going to completely leave their body, and they're going to have this like really like vivid like experience, just like how we're kind of experiencing things now. And I just find that that's not the case. And so I think when that doesn't happen for people, they're like, oh, well, I guess what I experienced wasn't really the real deal. And that's just sort of unfortunate. I think we have sometimes overblown expectations of things, and then it can kind of get in the way of our actual experiences.
When I think of like ritual with people, like I do a lot of coven stuff, oftentimes those rituals in my mind are kind of hazy too, right? I mean, I'm in a different place in a different time, so to speak, and things aren't quite the same. So a ritual in the astral is very much to me like a ritual in person, because they both have that feel. It's almost like somebody put Vaseline over the camera or something, right? And I experience all of my rituals that way because they're all otherworldly.
Yeah, which also, I mean, also brings in, you know, I talk a lot about visualization, and for me, I try to break that down to being, you know, this is more than just like imagining images in your mind, because that's not always an option for people. You know, and for me, when I engage in these experiences, it's often not really image based. It's almost more knowing based. And I think sometimes it's kind of hard to describe. It's like, I know what's happening and I know what the Sabbath is, versus like seeing these really distinct, colorful images. It's almost more, in my mind, it's almost like these more wispy, kind of smoky visions, if you will.
I mean, we're separated from how we normally exist. So why wouldn't things be a little bit different, right? Why would we expect them to be just like this?
Right. I think, and honestly, I mean, with that, I feel like it wouldn't maybe be as exciting if it was.
I like the mystery of it, right? Like, what is going to happen? What am I going to see? How will this be different from what I normally experience?
Right. And that's often a good indicator too of, I often get asked the question of like, well, how does this differ from like a guided meditation? And I think guided meditation and visualization is a really helpful tool transitioning into otherworldly space. But there comes a point where things start to unfold organically. And I think that's sort of the point when like, okay, now you're over the hedge. Now you're engaged in otherworldly experience. You still have an element of control because you're still in control of yourself, but the environment is less, you're not controlling that versus like in a guided meditation, you're very much in control of the imagery.
And a guided meditation too, I think other people are often in control of the imagery, right?
Oh,
if you're doing it with people,
Mm-hmm.
They're telling you where you're going. They're describing things like, oh, you come upon a fountain or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you kind of are crossed over and you're riding the hedge, right? You're not in control. They're not in control. Things happen and unfold as they will.
Right.
Not in a way that's dictated by yourself or by others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk history because we are both people who enjoy history.
We're nerds.
We are.
We're history nerds.
It's one of my favorite things is just reading the history and the folklore of witchcraft. And so kind of going into this project and really doing a lot of research into how this concept developed was a lot of fun. So I don't know. Let's talk about that. I don't know where to go with that, but I'm opening it up to you.
What I love about your book and when I started it, and when you write witchcraft books, sometimes you don't want to read witchcraft books anymore because it's like all you do, right? So you want to escape. But your book, I loved because you explored a part of witch history that's never really been explored before. There aren't books like this on the Sabbath. There aren't a whole lot of materials that can be utilized to look at it. I mean, you can draw from trial transcripts and stuff. I'm sure you use Ronald Hutton's The Witch to some degree, right? But his book isn't focused on that one thing, and your book is, which is really, really different. It's an achievement. I mean, this is like one of the 10 history books now I will recommend for the rest of my life,
Yeah,
I'm not supposed to be interviewing you, but I'm going to now. Like, how did you do that process of doing the research? Like, how did you decide like what bits to crawl into?
Yeah. Okay. So this was, well, first of all, a big part of the goal in writing this was to bridge this gap between like academia and actual practicing witchcraft. Because a lot of the texts and material that has been written about the Witches' Sabbath is academic. And so it's often found in these horrendously overpriced books that are written in academic language that is not super accessible for a lot of people. And yeah, it's written by people who are not witches. So, I would say that kind of one of the long-standing like primary texts on the Witches' Sabbath is Carlo Ginzburg's Ecstasies. So I was like, how can we take this? How can we make it more accessible? And then how can we kind of look at it in the context of like, okay, but we're also modern witches. And so when it came to the research process, I knew right away that I wanted to talk about the Sabbath as it shows up in a lot of different geographic locations. Sabbath narratives pop up all over Europe and in the early American colonies. It pops up in other places too that I didn't really get a chance to talk about. There are sort of later folkloric references to sort of witch meetings in the American South that are super fascinating. And so the first kind of question was like, how am I going to structure this book? The very first sort of iteration of that was going to be like a chapter for each country. But I quickly realized how redundant that would be to be like, okay, here's a chapter on like the Sabbath feast in Sweden. And like, here's this. And I was like, okay, that's not really going to work. So let's just weave it all together. And from there, it was just, I would take a section at a time, like, okay, for this amount of time, I'm going to look at, Sabbath feasts, and I'm going to look through different accounts and in different geographic locations. I'm going to take a lot of notes. I filled up quite a few notebooks in this process. It's funny because I think that kind of gives the air to people that I'm very organized, and I'm really, really not. I cannot tell you how many times there's like, I just didn't write down like where I found a piece of information. And then I would spend like the next week, like relentlessly, like, where did I find this? So it was sort of a disorganized process that eventually became organized. But yeah, it was a lot of looking through old books, tracking down trial transcripts. The sad thing is that there's a lot of places where that information is only in its native language, and so I'm not able to read it, or those texts are just unavailable. So there's a lot of places that I wasn't able to discuss in the book, or sources were limited. I mean, there's really only one good translated text about Polish witch trials, and it's like only like 100 pages of text. Right. So, I had a very slim amount of information to work on. Same with the Swedish witch trials. So yeah, it was just, I don't know if this answers the question, but it was just fun to look through these documents, to fall down rabbit holes. Thank God for Lauren, my copy editor at Llewellyn, because she was very, very awesome to work with and super helpful, and kind of falling down these rabbit holes and being like, we have to find, as close to the original source as possible. But what do you do when that source is like a scanned page from like a book from the 15th century that's written in calligraphy?
Which history really is kind of a needle in the haystack sort of proposition sometimes, because it's not taken seriously by academics. And as you say, the people who are researching it aren't practitioners for the most part, right? So they enter with all of these biases, so yeah, it's tough. It's really hard.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things too. I mean, I kind of figured this was going to be the curse that I would just have to bear after this book comes out, is finding new pieces of information that I'm like, that would have been really great to include. But then having to remind myself that, there's going to be a lot of witch trial lore that would have gone really well in this book. But then this book would have been like multi-volume. So if anything, I hope it just encourages readers to continue looking for more information. If you're intrigued by the idea of the Sabbath Queen, like, seek her out, because there's more references to her than what I was able to include.
I mean, books are the start of a journey, not the end, right? Yes.
Hopefully,
the idea is to get you excited about something so that maybe you'll do some more of your own research, or have those experiences for yourself. Were there any sacred cows that you encountered that you felt like you slayed or anything of that nature? Did you ever worry that maybe what I'm going to say might upset somebody?
Oh God, yes. Yeah. First of all, Llewellyn wanted me to, and I figured, it is a good idea to put a trigger warning at the beginning of the book, because I talk about some pretty nasty stuff. And so, the worrying about like people are going to be like, oh my God, he's talking about infanticide. Like, what is he trying to say? That we should be eating babies? And like, obviously not. Like, hopefully that's not what you're taking away from this book. You know, but I think one of the sort of pushbacks I get from people, even in regards to the Crooked Path, is like, why is he talking so much about Christianity? Like, he needs to clearly, you know, go be a Christian and not a witch, because these things don't work together. They don't go together. And so I think it's sort of upsetting for people sometimes to see, you know, that I'm talking about this, because they don't want there to be a connection. And sometimes, you know, that's for a good reason. I mean, people have had traumatic experiences. And hopefully, you know, from people who read my material or watch my videos, like, you know, that like, I'm never here to try to tell anybody that they have to be doing something a certain way, or they have to include this or not include that, because that's not what I'm here to do. So, you know, and obviously too, I think another big one is anytime you talk about the devil in terms of witchcraft, people bristle, to put it lightly.
Yes.
So, you know, I do expect that there are going to be people who read this book and really don't like what I have to say, and that's okay. I would just hope that, you know, people can, my hope is that people can sort of suspend their discomfort and read something that maybe they don't agree with or that challenges them, and recognize that that's okay.
One of the things about traditional witchcraft that I've really fallen in love with over the last 5 or 6 years, and I thank you for this in a lot of ways, is sort of this reemergence of engaging with the idea of the devil from the witch trials. And some people get so angry about that. And I think you and I both share that in our writing. You know, like, there's always that 1-star review on Amazon.
Right.
In my case, the horned god is not the devil. How dare you write that? And I'm like, the history is there. It's the truth, right? This influenced what we do today as modern witches. That doesn't mean that anybody is necessarily worshiping the king of hellfire, tormenting souls, but it's there. I'm sorry that makes you uncomfortable.
Right. And it's there a lot more than other more modern narratives.
Yeah.
Which again is not to say that anybody has to work with the devil or anything like that. But it's just, you can't deny that history. You can't deny that folklore, and you can't deny that influence. Yes. So I don't know where I was going with that. I feel like there was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten.
It's okay. It's okay. The devil has your tongue.
He does. I think it was just going to be about, you know, and I talk about this in the book, is that, I mean, even in trial transcripts, I mean, descriptions of the devil and interactions with the devil are very mixed. And I think sometimes people are really looking for things to be very simple. And when it comes to witchcraft, like, things aren't simple. So like a good example is like sexual relations with the devil. There are a lot of accounts where that relationship is described as grotesque and painful and sometimes very overtly non-consensual. And then there are other times where, even though maybe it's described as, you know, like the devil's members described as like monstrous, is that these people are like, oh yeah, I love it. Like, it's great. You know, and so it's hard to say, like, there's no just one answer. I mean, it's the same thing again with descriptions of the Sabbath feast. There are a lot of descriptions where they're like, oh yeah, like the food was super gross. It was moldy. It wasn't fulfilling. It just felt like we were eating nothing but air. And then there's other times where it's described as like, this was delicious, like yum, can't get enough. All the butter. You know, so there's not just one answer. There's many answers.
Yeah, I usually see most of I mean, when I look at the witch trial stuff, I usually see anything having to do with the devil or the horned god is kind of positive in a way. And usually people are happy to be there. He's offering them things. He's saying, don't, you know, enjoy life, live life to its fullest. I mean, The sacrificing babies is always problematic,
Mhm.
but there's no evidence. You know, there's no evidence of anything like that ever happening. You know,
Right. And, you know, and I would say that, and I talk about this a little bit when I talk in the section about cannibalism, is that mentions of like sacrificing babies, eating babies, cannibalism in general, like it happens. It's not infrequent. Or rather, it's not rare, but it's not infrequent, or it is infrequent, if that makes sense. I find that a lot of focus is spent on other things, particularly sex, than it is about anything having to do with sacrifice, or things like that. It's actually quite fascinating. It seems like when we talk about some of the early development of the Sabbath narrative, really the claims about infanticide and cannibalism were a lot more popular early on, when the focus was still on specific groups, such as heretics, like the Waldensians.
well, I mean, there's such a long history of accusing people of infanticide and eating babies and things. I mean, Christians were accused of it. Followers of Dionysus were accused of it. You know, it makes sense that witches would be accused of it. And then, you know, and the sex thing is a chance in a repressed society to actually talk about sex.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, like it's kind of, I mean, it's really gross actually, like, and sad thinking about a lot of these interrogators as, you know, as sort of horny, repressed men who found this like outlet to like, you know, in a socially acceptable way, get out their sexual fantasies, which often are very overtly misogynistic, but just as sort of like a study of people from that lens, it's something.
Are you happy with the reaction to the book thus far?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like people are very excited. So I'm excited. It's always nerve-wracking. You know, you work so hard on this and you put it out there and you know that like now it's for the people. And, you know, I don't think any book is above critique or anything like that. But it is nerve-wracking because you know that there are going to be people who are not so kind. But I think that, you know, after having written the first book, I think I've gotten a pretty good handle on dealing with the not so nice people. I mean, I think a lot of times it just comes down to sort of those critical thinking skills and maybe lack thereof, or people just, you know, having emotional reactions to things and not really knowing what to do with that. And so one way of dealing with that is to challenge that in a way that is more attacking than anything, I guess.
As an author, though, like you put your soul into something, right? I mean, there's no money in this. Like, there's no money in writing books for a company like Llewellyn. You do it because you love it and you want to share something with people. And then you put it out there, and then like you see those 1-star reviews, and they like kill you a little bit, right? I mean, it hurts.
And also, just like public service announcement to everybody: if you order a book like on Amazon and it comes damaged or ripped, please do not leave a 1-star review being like, "This book was damaged," because that's not our fault. But now that's punishing us by lowering our review status on Amazon. Take it up with Amazon. Please don't leave a review because we didn't do it. It's not our fault.
Yeah. Review the contents of the book, right, not the condition of the book.
Right. Because I've seen that for, no, I don't think anybody's done that for my book, but I've seen that for other authors. And I'm like, oh.
I had a poor person, like they ordered one of my books, I think from a secondary seller, and they got an advanced reader copy, not a real copy. And I wanted to just send them a copy. Like I would just send them one. I don't care, right? Because I feel bad for them. But as an author, you're not allowed to reply to reviews on your page, like to people who have reviewed your books. Yeah. So I can't get in touch with this person to tell them I would happily send you a book.
Right.
Yeah. Damn you, Amazon, making things difficult.
I know. I'll bring this up because this is sort of a history point that I think we both are interested in, is Margaret Murray. Because I, as part of the research in this book, was sort of looking at the witch cult hypothesis. And one of the things that was really interesting to find is that Margaret Murray did not create the witch cult hypothesis. She definitely produced what I would say is the most like put together and like illustrative, what is that word? Like illustrative, we'll just go with that, version of it. But ideas about witch cults and sort of the witch trials being, you know, a survival or bastardization of some pagan religion was already going around like 2 centuries before she wrote The Witch Cult in Western Europe. And so I was really fascinated by that and really passionate about writing that and putting that out there for people, because I feel like she just gets so much flack.
You know, and Murray shouldn't get flack. So much of what all of us do comes straight from the pages of Murray. Right. I think Murray is like one of the 5 most important people in the history of the modern witchcraft revival. I mean, she wrote books that made witchcraft look like something you wanted to do, especially God of the Witches. I think God of the Witches is the better of the books, because Witch Cult, like, you'll read it and then there's like a passage in French, right?
Yeah.
It's not translated. So if you really want to get into it, you have to go and figure it out yourself. I mean, it's a pain in the ass to read, but the God of the Witches is like breezy. It's, you know, fun to read in. It, you know, it's well written, and she weaves this story, and it's maybe she didn't necessarily come up with all of it. I mean, there's Jules Michelet, you know, which was a big influence, I think, on her, but she told it better than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
And she was sympathetic to it. She loved the witches. You can feel that too, right?
Right.
Yeah, she wanted to overthrow Christianity. And there's stories of her doing magic spells in the break room of the university where she worked, you know, which I think is just so incredibly badass.
Right. It's just, yeah, I think it's sad. She gets a lot of flack. And so I really just wanted to put that out there for people. And too, like you said, like kind of maybe encouraging people to realize that, you know, she has had a lot of influence on the development of modern witchcraft. I mean, you can see a direct line from Murray to Gardner, from Gardner, so on and so forth. And so again, it's one of those things where it's like a pet peeve of mine when I see people be like, oh, Margaret Murray and her stupid fake theories. Let me go do all these witchcraft things that, you know, may or may not have existed or continued on without that line of influence.
I think of Murray as sort of a weaver of mythology in a way, right? Whether or not things happened exactly like she said doesn't matter. What's important is, are you inspired by it? Do you take things from it? Do you use it to grow your own practice? And, you know, I go to rituals and people are asking me to do weird things. And then, you know, I'm rereading some Murray and I'm like, oh, they took that directly from Witch Cult or God of the Witches or something, right? I mean, and that's the truth, especially witchcrafts that were really developed in the, you know, like ritual practices developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They had very little books to look at. And one of the books that they were always reading was Margaret Murray's. So all of that stuff kind of just seeps in, whether you know it's her or not.
And her books too, as sort of a weaver of mythology and of you know, different pieces from trial transcripts, is her books are really good as just kind of repositories of that information, because she cites where she gets things from. So, you know, while I was writing this book, I was able to like look at a section where she talks about something and then be like, oh yes, this piece from a trial confession is really interesting. Okay, she got it from this place. Let me go track that down. So I think her books, even if you're not going to look at the overall narrative, just looking at the individual parts can be really useful and beneficial.
Yeah, there were a couple of times when I was writing the Horned God of the Witches, I used Margaret Murray's notes to go down rabbit holes. Right, her footnotes were like, "Oh, this is where that comes from. I should look at this and go backwards from there."
Which also, for anyone who has not read Jason's book, The Horned God of the Witches, what is wrong with you? Because it's fantastic. I mean, all of your books are fantastic, but that's kind of what I've always said, is that The Horned God of the Witches is sort of like the updated, more like academically correct version of the Witch's God. I think Murray would be proud.
Well, what I loved is the Horned God of the Witches came out on the 100th anniversary of Witch Cult in Western Europe.
You have all these cool dates. So auspicious.
I didn't realize it until like almost towards the end of the writing process. I think I was like finishing the acknowledgments like 3 months before it was going to go to press, and then before it was going to come out. And I was like, oh, Margaret Murray, 100 years. And I mean, the Horned God of the Witches, a play on the God of the Witches, right? Yeah. But I mean, I used to be one of those people who's kind of a jerk to Margaret Murray, like, oh, her history is bad and all that. And now I feel like she's just such this huge figure, and I love her. I love her crankiness, and because if you read stories, she was a very vengeful woman. If you didn't agree with Murray, she would attack you. She was very passionate about her beliefs, but I love that passion. Right. It's great that I can sort of geek out over Margaret Murray with you. Yeah. So
I've got about 3 minutes left of your time. Any last questions or comments?
Oh, I think your book is terrific, and I loved it. And I will say it was kind of hard writing the introduction because you didn't want to give away anything in the book, right? So it was like, wow, this is kind of tough. So, it was a challenge, but there's nothing like this book, which is one of the things that I love about it. And it's kind of like my favorite of new sort of witch books. I mean, there's New World Witchery that came out last year, which I really liked. There's history in them for us nerds, but there's also practical application, right? I mean, we're going to take this history and, show you what to do with it so you can actually do witchcraft instead of reading just about witchcraft. And I love that about your work. And also, I'm a big fan of yours now. I mean, I'm a fanboy of yours because you write about traditional witchcraft in a way that is just so inviting and easy to understand. And I feel that for a long time, probably taking a page from Robert Cochrane, people wrote about traditional witchcraft in a way that was like deliberately difficult, right? And people want to practice and they need information, and you're great for that. So thank you. Well, you've influenced me a lot. I mean, it's a couple of books. I think there's like lots of footnotes with you on there.
Thank you. Well, and again, I mean, thank you so much for writing the foreword. I knew like right away, like when it was like, who's going to write the foreword of your book? I was like, well, I know who it's going to be. And it was really important, to me for you to write it, not only just because you're a fellow history nerd, but you've been a big influence on my writing, and even kind of, I would say, getting me to where I am today in terms of, blogging, which I don't really do much anymore.
Neither do I.
and writing books. So I've always looked up to you and seen you as, not only a friend, but a mentor. So it was really awesome to have your words be the kind of opening to this book.
Well, I was honored, like to be associated with this book is like a blessing.
Yay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it was so awesome having you on.
This was fun. I hope that I see you this year somewhere.
Yeah, hopefully. Maybe at the Sabbath. We'll just have to meet in the other worlds.
Yay. That has its own rewards.
It does.
All right. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I'm excited for you. Thank you for chatting with me. This has been great.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Thank you for being here. Okay, so that was Jason Mankey. He's awesome. So, okay, so I'm gonna turn it over to kind of questions. So if you've already asked a question, what I'm gonna ask you to do is to just send it again. That way I don't have to scroll up through the chat. And yeah, and we'll see what comes up. Okay, so first question, can you talk about Sparr's experience with the Sabbath as told in the book by Moonlight and Spirit Flight? Off the top of my head, I'm not sure specifically what you're talking about, but I will talk about one of his experiences that may be worth thinking of the same thing. Oh, yes. Okay. This is the same story. Okay. So Osmond Sparr, he was a chaos magician, ceremonial magician, kind of many different things back in the day. And his writing has had a big influence on concepts of the Sabbath in modern traditional witchcraft. And one of the experiences that he had at one point that he recalls is getting on a night bus. And the bus was kind of crowded with these women, and he described these women as kind of uncanny. They sort of had this aura to them. And, he started kind of feeling, like something's going on, right? And he later kind of makes this connection that these women were actually witches, and they were taking this bus to go to their Sabbath. And so he kind of looked at it as like having this otherworldly experience while on this bus. And it's just sort of a very delightful story, kind of thinking about this, more modern kind of coven of witches taking the bus to their Sabbath. It also makes me think of the night bus from Harry Potter as well. So I get a lot of just different images in my mind. And I talk about that in this book as well. The bus story. Okay. Next question. Have you always been on your own or been in a coven? So I have pretty much been solitary my entire witchcraft journey. I have done rituals with different practitioners in the past, and I will do that when the opportunity presents itself. But by and large, I consider myself a solitary practitioner. And I use solitary really because I'm working with a lot of spirits, and so in a way they're sort of, my own coven. So, but a lot of the work I do is specifically kind of solitary in nature, in terms of like hedge crossing, traveling to the Sabbath and such. Does your book address practical how-to instruction? Yes. So the way that the book is structured is sort of every other chapter. So one chapter will talk about kind of history and folklore, and then the next chapter will talk about sort of practical how-to. So if you are reading this and you're like, hey, I want to journey to the Witch's Sabbath, that's all explained in here of how you can do that. There's a lot of recipes, exercises, hands-on stuff. So definitely instructional pieces. Do you think the Sabbath is purely spiritual thing, or can it be physical? Yes, it definitely can be physical. And actually there is a ritual towards the end of the book for a physical Sabbath sort of reenactment. So what you would experience in the other world, or what you would find in these, in the folklore, in the trial transcripts, I give a ritual of how you can enact that in physical space. So while I would say that in the context that I'm talking about in this book and in traditional witchcraft, it is by and large an otherworldly experience. But I think that there are ways that you can kind of pull that into the physical realm as well. My friend and I both come from a Wiccan background, and our tradition we belong to is 1734 mixed with Celtic paganism. Can you recommend some books to get us started on research on pre-Wiccan history? Yes. So in terms of like pre-Wiccan, kind of modern witchcraft, that's kind of a tricky territory. And in that case, I would recommend reading specifically things like Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. But you're going to end up, really what you're going to end up looking into is a lot of history books. So things also like Ronald Hutton's book, The Witch, is phenomenal. Michael Howard has a series of books of kind of witchcraft folklore from the British Isles. There's currently 4 volumes. There's a mysterious 5th volume that may or may not ever come out. So yes, and I actually have an old YouTube video of traditional witchcraft book recommendations, so I'd recommend checking that out. Is your book as practical as your first one, The Crooked Path? I would say yes, just because my style in general is always going to be practical. I am somebody who's very down to earth, if I can say so myself. And so like I was talking about earlier with Jason, I think sometimes, especially when it comes to things regarding hedge crossing or spirit work, I guess you could even say magic in general, I think sometimes we have these overblown expectations of what things are going to look like, how we're going to experience them. And for me, I'm very big on promoting like just being real, celebrating just the reality of how these things work, and that sometimes they're working in ways that are a lot more subtle, and that's okay. And that doesn't make it any less special or authentic or anything like that. How do you balance this work? Yes. So like, yes. So I'm not just an author. I also work as a mental health therapist. And so I'm very busy during the week with that. In terms of just balancing things, it's just always a continuous process. I always like to remind people that, balance is not a fixed point. It's always something that we sort of approach, and then we get distance from, and then we approach it again. So usually if we're in a moment of complete balance, it's usually pretty ephemeral. It doesn't stick around for very long. Or maybe that's just me. But for kind of maintaining witchcraft practice is I work with, again, just a lot of really practical everyday things. Leaving offerings to spirits, just greeting spirits, spending time just reflecting, noticing things in my natural landscape and such. So hopefully that answers the question. Do you have any tips for a relatively new witch that is interested in working with spirits but is kind of scared? My biggest sort of tips would just to be, respecting your boundaries, respecting the spirit's boundaries. So, you are not required to work with any spirit. If it's like, and, for example, even if a spirit approaches you and is like, hey, I want to work with you, you don't have to. You can tell them no, and that's okay. So if you're just starting, I would say find or think of a spirit that you would feel comfortable working with. Do some research about this type of spirit, learn what you can, and just start slow. And if at any point things feel wrong or you're not sure, you can always ask another practitioner, and kind of go from there. But when it comes to working with spirits, I will always say that it's very similar to working with humans. Open communication and healthy boundaries are important. Thoughts on contemporary gendering of witch mother and witch father, or spirits, deities generally? Do you think it's valuable for the sake of adhering to tradition? This is a really excellent question, and one that I really felt like I had a chance to address in the Witch's Sabbath, and it's something that I really wish that I had emphasized more in the Crooked Path. Is this idea of gendering. I would say that gendering spirits, it's not necessary. And if it's something that, that you don't jive with, you don't feel comfortable with, then I would say don't do it. If you do feel like it is, go for it. I fell somewhere in the middle. But for example, like you'll read in the Witch's Sabbath about how the devil sort of is always shifting between forms. And sometimes he appears as a man, sometimes he appears as a woman, sometimes he appears as an animal or a mix of different things. And I think that really shows us just the fluidity of spirits and of magic in general, that, it's all things and no things. It's on this, spectrum that's constantly moving. So it just depends. It depends on who you are and what meaning those things have to you. How do you navigate, interpret, understand elements of anti-Semitism in Sabbath lore? Another really great question. And again, something that's talked about in the book. So you might have noticed when I was reading earlier, the use of the term synagogue. And that specifically comes out of early anti-Semitic ideas, connecting specifically Jewish people with sorcery and demon worship. So the persecution of Jewish people played a big role in the development of Sabbath folklore. So in terms of how I would navigate it, it's really about looking at, okay, how did that influence come about? Understanding the history of what happened, and looking at, just honoring those people that were persecuted. One thing I will say is that there's quite a few different groups of people that the persecution of these people played a role in the development. And so one of the first things that you'll find in sort of the opening of our examination of early development is the persecution of Christians, which I think is going to really shock a lot of people. But there's this sort of chain reaction that happens, and it sort of starts there. I'm sure that there's probably even places before that where it was starting, but this is kind of a big prominent one. And then that persecution led into persecution of people with leprosy, as well as Jewish people. And that then in turn led into persecution of groups of people deemed heretical. And it just kind of keeps going until we eventually emerge with the persecution of suspected witches. Okay, I think I'm all caught up on questions. These are really great questions, everyone, so thank you. Let's keep the questions going, because now I feel like I'm on a roll. Okay, another question. What book influenced you most as a beginner? Does one stand out? It depends. I mean, there's a lot of different books that really influenced me, and like most people, I got into witchcraft very young. I've talked about it in a few different places, but witches have always been something that I've been very fascinated with, even as a very, very little child. And so I would say a lot of, even sort of the early kind of more storybooks that I read were really influential. There's one book in particular. It's called the Book of Wizardcraft. It is a book of literal crafts. It's a very beautiful book, and I still have it. But that was a book that really kind of helped shape just a magical view of the world around me. As I got older, I really kind of found, modern witchcraft in the sense of like, hey, this is something that other people are doing as well. When I was about 11, 12 years old. And I'm trying to think, I can't remember who wrote, there's been a few different editions of it, but one of the first books that I read was the Everything Book of Witchcraft in Wicca. I know that one of the reprints is written by Skye Alexander. That was not the one that I read though. But that one was really big, and then I kind of read a lot of the books that people read, To Ride a Silver Broomstick, Scott Cunningham's Wicca. And then I would say when I started kind of moving more into traditional witchcraft, I would say like actually a book that was really influential on my just kind of getting into otherworldly travel, engaging more with spirits was Christopher Penczak's The Temple of Shamanic Witchcraft. That book was very influential on me. And then in terms of more traditional witchcraft-oriented books, both the Robert Cochrane letters and the Roebuck and the Thicket were highly influential. Treading the Mill by Nigel Pearson, obviously A Cornish Book of Ways. All of those books really helped inspire me to look more into, my own local landscape, to look more into folklore and things like that. So quite a few books. I mean, I feel like I'm constantly being influenced and inspired by books. So... Oh, Cunningham's Earth Power. Yes, that's another really good book that I feel like, maybe not as many people have read or are aware of. And then the follow-up to that, a very good book just about very practical magic that's rooted in your local landscape. Also, another book that was really influential on me was The Devil's Plantation by Nigel Pearson. I really, really enjoyed that book. And it was another book that just really helped me see that like there's, that there are a lot of ways to engage with your local land and folklore. Do you have a favorite witchy movie? Yes. So I love witchcraft related media. So it's kind of a toss up. I will always have a very, very deep love for practical magic, like most witches. That movie has played a major role in my life. I think the first time I saw it, I was probably 5 years old. And it's been, a huge part of my life ever since. The books have played a huge part in my life. Outside of that, I'm a really big fan of Season of the Witch. from the 1970s. I love that film. I love the character Joan. I love the fact that the book that she's using in it is literally Paul Hewson's Mastering Witchcraft. So you get to see like someone enacting the rituals from that book. I just think it is amazing. I also really love The Love Witch. I think that's a fantastic movie. Everything about it is just so trippy and wild. And I feel like there's just so many quotable lines. It's incredible. Do you see a difference between folk witchcraft versus traditional witchcraft? And also, how do you balance between influence from which authors generally categorized as traditional versus lore? This is a good question. And it's a question that Marshall, the Witch of Southern Light, posed a few weeks back. This was interesting to see different people's answers. So for me, I see traditional witchcraft and folkloric witchcraft as largely interchangeable. I think that ultimately folkloric witchcraft is a more helpful term, because when I'm referring to traditional witchcraft, I'm specifically talking about non-Wiccan forms of witchcraft that are influenced by folklore. And so I think the term folkloric witchcraft just specifically says that. And what has sort of been interesting is that traditional witchcraft is the term that's been used for quite a while. And so now there's sort of this introduction of a new term that I think is great, but I've largely stuck to using traditional witchcraft just because that is the term that I have used for so long. But I do see them as largely interchangeable. I do think that you could make the case that there's a little bit more nuance where traditional witchcraft might be more rooted in specific traditions. So like, for example, like the writings of Robert Cochrane, things like that, versus like folkloric witchcraft being more kind of more based in local landscape kind of stuff. But for me, I see them as largely interchangeable. And I would say that's kind of the same thing with reading, different authors. So like, for example, like if you read The Crooked Path and then you read Roger Horn's book, Folkloric Witchcraft, I would say you're going to largely be seeing a lot of the same concepts. Which is also a very fantastic book if anybody has not read it. Roger Horn is an excellent author. And his most recent book, A Broom at Midnight, also talks a lot about hedge crossing and the Witch's Sabbath. And again, it's just a very beautifully written book. I highly recommend it. Suspiria, yes, both the original and the remake are incredible. And I did post on Instagram, I did post a link to a Spotify playlist entitled The Witch's Sabbath. And it's 13 songs that I listened to while writing this book. And one of them comes from the Suspiria, the remake comes from the soundtrack. These days, it seems everyone is fixated on labels: crystal witch, forest witch, tea witch, TikTok witches, etc. Do you think young witches are focusing too much on this kind of stuff? Yes and no. I mean, I think labels are always going to be tricky because on one hand, I think they give us a sense of identity. They give us something to focus on, and they can kind of provide a sense of structure. At the same time, they can also be really restrictive at times. I'm never going to be, it's not my job to tell somebody like, oh, you're not a forest witch, you're just a witch. Like don't all witches like forests? Or like somebody who's like, I'm an elemental witch. Like, well, don't most witches work with the elements? Like, so then can you not also be a lunar witch? If you're not a lunar witch, does that mean you can't work with the moon? I think it's just, it's up to the individual. I mean, if somebody were to come up to me and introduce themselves as, a crystal witch, like, okay, like I would maybe ask you more like, oh, like, what does that mean to you? because I'm generally interested in kind of what that means. But, you know, in terms of, are people focusing on it too much? Maybe. But that's their job to worry about, not mine. What are your thoughts on the show Motherland? Honestly, I watched a few episodes of the first season, and it just didn't really, I don't know, it just didn't really interest me. It didn't really pull me in as much. Although that's been the case for multiple shows in the past that then I later end up watching and really liking. So there's a chance I might give it another shot in the future. But I don't know. I wasn't super into it. Do you think that cultural appropriation needs to be addressed when discussing traditional witchcraft? I think it needs to be addressed when talking about any form of witchcraft. You know, this is a really big, hot topic. But I think we need to really be aware of, you know, what we're doing, why we're doing it, where it comes from, you know, and just leaving things alone that aren't ours. You know, and I think everybody has different ways of looking at that. But I do think it's an important conversation that we need to be having. So, and yeah, there's a lot to say about that. And a lot of feelings come up for a lot of people. So I don't know if that helps, but I do think it needs to be addressed. What do you think of the term black magic? Is it always inherently racist, or does it depend on context, such as region, culture, tradition? Honestly, I just think it's not a very helpful term. I mean, I understand the argument of why it is a racist term. And I think that's an important conversation too. But I also think just by and large, it's just not a helpful term. I mean, what are we talking about when we're talking about black magic? How does, you know, what distinguishes that from white magic? And to be quite honest, it kind of surprises me when people are still using that term, because I just feel like it's just generally outdated. I mean, I always think about the line from The Craft, you know, like, I'm like, oh, okay, like we're not over that yet. Like magic is not white or black, good or bad. It's up to the practitioner. You know, and at the same time, like, if the distinction we're making is that black magic is magic that causes harm and white magic is magic that is beneficial, like, we have better terms for that. We have terms that are better at describing that, and just really putting it out there than using sort of vague terms like black magic or white magic. Favorite means of divination. What do you see as the source of divinatory communication? Particular spirits, fate, the spirit of the tool itself? So pretty basic, tarot. And I see it as kind of a mixture of all of those. I mean, I think that, you know, as an animist, I would say that, you know, your tarot decks have their own, you know, cumulative spirit that you're interacting with. I think you're also interacting with, you know, different spirits, especially if you're specifically asking for guidance. And then you're tapping into your own intuition, your own psychic faculties, as well as just your own psyche. I often think of just the way that the images unlock different insights that are kind of already within us. We're not necessarily even pulling those from, you know, the other world or kind of the ether or what have you. I think it's something that we're sort of just coming to realize that's maybe been kind of operating in our subconscious. Mhm. Yeah, so kind of follow-up statement talking about Gemma Gary's distinctions between black, gray, green, and red magic. I think that yes, that is sort of a different thing. I would kind of categorize that differently because in that case, you're talking about quite a few different kind of you're talking about something different than just like this binary, right? And that's really what I think the concept of black magic and white magic is. It's this moral kind of binary. And so I think what Gemma Gary's talking about with those different kind of colors of magic is different. So I wouldn't necessarily lump that into kind of the same conversation. Okay. So if there's other questions, I'm thinking about wrapping up relatively soon. So if you have any last questions, especially questions about the book, about the Witch's Sabbath, now is the time to ask them. Best flying ointment recipe, the one I include in my book. I do. So I do include. It is the same recipe from the Crooked Path. It's a good recipe for creating a flying ointment if you're a beginner, but I think it's useful even for people who are not beginners. But the reason I say beginners is that it is a non-toxic flying ointment recipe, so it's not using any of the nightshade plants, but it is still very effective, and I do thoroughly enjoy using it when I do. So I would say, that in my opinion is the best recipe, or the one that I feel most comfortable giving to the public. Also, just real quick on the topic, I also am a very firm believer that flying ointment is not necessary. So it is a really awesome tool. It's great. I mean, I would say that if you are somebody who is kind of more called towards working with those plants or working with the poison path, like this is not, this is not to shit on that practice. But I would just say, like, if you are somebody who is looking to get into hedge crossing, journeying to the Sabbath, just know that like it's not an inherently necessary thing. And sometimes I think it's best to actually work to develop those skills without the use of flying ointment first. And then once you have a handle on that, then if you want to try incorporating flying ointment. Yes, so the book is available. It is officially out as of today. So you can order it from Amazon. You can order it directly from Llewellyn. Obviously, always the kind of preferred method would be to get it locally. So, getting it from a local bookseller if you're able to. I'm not here to judge anyone who's ordering books off of Amazon because I order books from Amazon. But I know that a lot of people don't like Amazon for very good reasons. And so just, that there's other options out there besides just Amazon. Barnes & Noble, again, you can order it directly from Llewellyn. So, yeah. So, yes, okay. So I'm going to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes to ask your last minute questions. Do you touch on dual faith, multi-faith elements of the Sabbath or witchcraft more in general? So I do talk about, obviously the book has a lot of information just pertaining to sort of that dual faith mixture, right? So like these kind of like early pagan remnants of folklore being mixed in with more ecclesiastical ideals. I wouldn't say it's like specifically touched upon outright or like saying it in that sort of verbiage. That's something, specifically talking about dual faithism as dual faithism is something you'll find in The Crooked Path. This book sort of just, I guess, operates under the assumption that we're already kind of aware of that. Okay, I'm going to call it. Okay, so thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for asking all of these wonderful questions. Again, thank you to everyone who has pre-ordered, ordered a copy of The Witch's Sabbath. It really means a lot. This is something that still doesn't quite feel real. So it's just awesome to see that, people are interested in the things that I have to say. And I'm really passionate about writing, and I'm particularly passionate about our history and folklore as witches. So it was, this is a really, really, not that The Crooked Path isn't, but this is a really important book to me, just to be able to share a lot of this information that, as we said earlier, is sometimes kind of out of people's hands and that we're not always aware of because it's not necessarily talked about in a lot of more accessible or popular books. So please give it a read. Please give a review if you feel so inclined. Yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off. So I hope you all have an excellent rest of your day. Thank you again so much for being here. This has been a lot of fun. It really means a lot. So looking forward to seeing your cool tagged pictures on Instagram. And until next time, take care.